Russia was able to seize a considerable amount of territory very early in the war. It was really the most successful of their initiatives, and they actually took control of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant in all of Europe. So the Kherson offensive was launched by Ukraine with a great deal of fanfare, and so it's been going on now for 2-3 weeks. But at this time, it appears as though the Russian forces have repelled this Ukrainian offensive, the drive to recapture Kherson. The Ukrainians attempted to attack in 3 directions. Actually, there were multiple attacks along the Dnieper River, but in the end, none of the attacks made substantial gains. They did manage to edge in on the periphery of the Russian-controlled areas, but the gains were not terribly significant. They seemed to lack adequate armored vehicle, aircraft, and artillery support. They did launch a sort of a dramatic commando attack across the river in an attempt to seize the Zaporizhia power plant and to recapture that. The Russians captured it relatively easily early in the war, but the commando attack was a disastrous failure. The commandos were detected coming across in barges, and all of them were eliminated. Moscow claims, I think, credibly, that there were literally hundreds of tanks and armored personnel carriers destroyed. Moscow, I think the last I heard, they were saying that about 3,000 Ukrainian troops were killed. Tremendous number filled up the hospitals in nearby cities like Odessa, which is a huge port city. And so lots of casualties, lots of suffering there. Ukraine did manage to put 3 pontoon bridges across the Dnieper River, but it appears as though all of those were destroyed, and probably quite a number of Ukrainian troops were trapped and exposed to Russian artillery across the river. The Russian Air Force seemed to come out in strength, much more so than they had engaged any time before. It is interesting if the counteroffensive, if the Ukrainian counteroffensive does completely fail, it leaves the massive port of Odessa somewhat exposed. The importance of Odessa is that Ukraine lost a very important port city at Mariupol, but in any event, I apologize. I may have the name of that particular city wrong, but they did lose a very important seaport on the Black Sea. So their ability to export has been cut down substantially. Right now, Odessa can flow a lot of freight. It can export a great deal through there. The Ukrainian wheat harvest is being shipped out through Odessa. So it does create a sort of a danger for Ukraine if anything were to happen, if the Russians somehow were to hook around and capture Odessa. It potentially could force an end to the war. Now, so let's look to the area where Ukraine is making very dramatic uh, uh, advances, and this is in the east of the country, uh, where the Ukrainian army has punched deeply through Russian lines, and there are some reports indicating that they've actually reached the Russian border. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city. The Ukrainians have never lost control of Kharkiv. So the Ukrainian army has advanced very, very rapidly, and they've recaptured hundreds of square miles of territory from the Russian troops that managed to occupy it earlier. There are reports of traffic jams of cars filled with Ukrainians fleeing into Russia to escape the advancing Ukrainian forces. Now, Ukraine is very complex because about a third of the people are Russian-speaking people. So you can think of them as Russian Ukrainians. The other two-thirds are Ukrainian speakers. There's tremendous ethnic friction between them at this time. It hasn't always been that way, but this is the way wars go. Nations like to foster racial, religious hatreds in order to divide people. And NATO has done that very effectively with the Ukrainians. So what you have is the Ukrainians who are Russian speakers, they are fleeing to escape into Russia. Russia's made it very easy for them to cross into Russia. Contrary to what you read in mainstream media, there really are huge numbers of refugees moving out of Ukraine and into Russia. So we'll see where that goes. Now, the gains that Ukraine has made in the Kharkiv area have been really politically vital for Zelensky. He's trying to keep Europe united behind Ukraine, keep them flowing in floods of money, floods of weapons. All of this is happening while the Europeans are losing enthusiasm for NATO's war against Russia. Now, there was a very interesting article that I ran across today. It may have been in the Wall Street Journal, but they were talking about the impact of the cutoff in Russian gas on the heavy industries in Europe. What's happening, the European Union has decided that they're going to restrict people from using natural gas leading up to the winter, because they know in the winter time people will need the natural gas for heating, and they're afraid that that there may be an uprising of the people if they're unable to heat their homes during the winter. You'll recall that very early in the war, the United States pressured Europe to not open the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This was a massive, capital-intensive project that was agreed upon by Russia, by Germany, by other countries like Denmark, and they all worked together to be able to bring Russian gas in without a lot of political interference from Ukraine, so that they would have a more reliable source. But early on, the United States, which certainly had an eye towards capturing the market for liquefied natural gas, more or less ordered Europe to stop and not to open the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Europe, and particularly Germany, they're not nearly as independent as Americans like to believe. They really operate somewhat as an extension of the United States over in Europe. And the U.S. is always much more concerned about what happens here than what happens there. So we were able to cut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And then early in the war with the sanctions, we basically got Europe to agree that they would stop paying for the Russian gas that they were getting through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And so naturally, Russia balked at providing gas for free because it costs them money to produce, and they have to make some money to support their people. So we got in this bizarre back and forth where Russia has continually cut down on the amount of natural gas they supply. Europe said, we're not paying. We're not going to pay. We're not going to pay in euros. We're not going to pay in dollars. We're just going to stop paying. But at the same time, we expect you to keep supplying us with gas. Quite strange. But in any event, then Russia set up alternatives. They said, okay, well, you don't want to pay in euros or dollars. Go ahead and pay us in rubles. From now on, we insist that you pay us in rubles. And for the longest time, Europe balked at that. No, we can't pay in Europe. We're not going to pay anything for your gas, but we really expect you to supply us. In any event, this has gone on and on. Russia now is providing relatively little natural gas to Europe. And what's happening, the foundation of Europe's economy is industrial production. So they produce fertilizer, they produce chemicals, they produce automobiles, they produce aluminum sheeting used in auto production and other things. Heavy things. They produce glass, and all of these things rely on cheap, reliable energy from Russia. We've made up for part of it through expensive American liquefied natural gas. We're more than anxious to ship it. We were able to ship lots of it, but it is much more expensive to Europe than what they used to get from Russia. So what's happening is gradually factories are shutting down in Europe, a significant number of them, and the industrial production of Europe is falling off a cliff, and there's some indication that the United States, once we have captured their market for natural gas, we may not allow them to resume importing gas from Russia. Of course, that'd be very bad for Russia, but extremely bad for Europe, because what it would mean is that over time, their industrial base will erode. There will be all sorts of social dislocation and that type of thing. But so far, the U.S. has, the Biden administration has shown very little interest in what happens to Europe, what their future may be. So, okay, so back to the invasion, I shouldn't say the invasion, but the recapture of the areas around Kharkiv by the Ukrainian forces. The area around Kharkiv was very thinly defended by the Russians. I'm not sure why it was quite so defended, so lightly defended, but they have basically National Guardsmen and Border Patrol people. They have managed to inflict a lot of casualties on the attacking Ukrainians, but because their numbers are so small, the Russian forces have withdrawn and moved back from one city to the other. So we'll see how far this goes on. The Ukrainians captured a very important city called Izium, which was a Russian logistics hub. So the Ukrainians are seizing areas that are important. They may be thinly defended, but in some cases, they have various logistics hubs. And the Russians are very dependent on railroads. And where the Ukrainians are able to seize a railroad hub, it potentially paralyzes a particular area. It makes it very difficult for the Russians to resupply their forces. So far, the Russians have not lost very many troops. And at the same time, the Ukrainian forces are being drawn very deeply into enemy territory. There is some concern in the West that the Ukrainian forces could be encircled by fresh Russian troops if they advance too far and too fast. We really don't know, honestly. But that's where we stand right now. Lots of things will be unfolding in the coming weeks, but for some of it, we're just going to have to wait and see. These are military secrets of the highest order, and so we'll wait and see.